Hello, I'm Jayne and this is Jenni Robertson, and together we undertook a master's project whilst we were students at La Trobe University with Associate Professor Jodie Oatman as our supervisor. And our project was our workplace psychosocial hazards being effectively managed. So the context of the problem: musculoskeletal disorders, or MSDs, and mental health disorders, MHDs, are significant workplace problems with high personal and organisational costs. A substantial evidence base supports the role of work-related psychosocial hazards in the development of MHDs and MSDs. Psychosocial hazards include, but are not limited to, factors related to job content, workload and work pace, work schedule, job control, organisational culture and function, and so on. Work-related hazards, both physical and psychosocial, in conjunction with the individual factors of the worker, can lead to a high biomechanical load, stress response and fatigue. This can result in hazardous personal states and the risk of musculoskeletal and mental health disorders. This is summarised in the slide in front of you now by Oakman et al. In 2016. So the issue, what is the issue? Evidence for real-world workplace management of psychosocial and physical hazards and their policies and procedures is limited. In Australia, this is taken from Safe Work Australia, $24 billion a year are spent on work-related body-stressing injuries, that's musculoskeletal injuries. $3 billion a year are spent on work-related mental stress. So we're not really making serious headway when it comes to tackling these problems. So the aim of our study was to explore the current strategies being used by organisations to manage work-related MSDs and MHDs. We did that by conducting semi-structured interviews with 25 work health and safety managers, and we did that in 3 different industries, namely health, retail and transport and logistics. Their policies in relation to physical and psychosocial hazards were also requested, and 22 of the 25 organisations provided their policies for us to do a score. An analysis of their organisational policies was conducted using an adapted policy scorecard from Lika et al., who did a policy analysis in the European Union. Just a quick summary of the participants. There were 12 participants from the health sector, 8 from retail and 5 from transport and logistics, making it 25 participants in total. Most participants had some sort of work health and safety qualification, but the extent of this was varied from no formal qualification through to a master's. Now, I was going to say that this slide was really busy, but having seen the stuff this morning, I went, no, it's actually not that busy. This is an adapted scorecard for psychosocial hazards, and this was adapted from Lika et al. And was used to score the psychosocial and physical hazards. The one shown here is for the psychosocial hazards scorecard. There were 5 key dimensions were scored from 0 to 4 for each key dimension. So on the left-hand side are the key dimensions. A score of 0 meant that the dimension was not covered or no reference, through to 5 being fully covered, with a possible maximum score of 25 for their psychosocial policies and 25 for their physical policies. The key dimensions that were sought in the psychosocial policies was the psychosocial hazards in the workplace referred to in the objectives and scope of the policy? Was the coverage of exposure factors in the workplace? What was it? What was the coverage of the related outcomes, the risk assessment aspects and the preventative actions? we did a very brief policy analysis and we looked at the mean policy scores. The policy documents were provided by 80% of the participants, and the sectors performed similarly for the policies relating to psychosocial hazards. Health and retail sectors performed similarly for their policy relating to physical hazards. Transport had consistently higher performance in policies relating to physical hazards, but this may have been because of the poor, small sample size. The combined total of the policy coverage of the physical hazards, the orange bars in the graph, score at an average of 8 points higher than the psychosocial hazard policy coverage, which is the blue bars in the graph. So the policies for the psychosocial hazards scored less than the physical hazards. Risk assessment and preventative actions were quite well covered for the physical hazards. Exposure outcomes were covered poorly for both psychosocial and physical hazards. Physical hazards were covered more comprehensively across all 5 areas, see the orange bars in the graph, and greater variability was found with the coverage of psychosocial hazards. Overall, the sectors performed similarly for the policy content with high variable performance across most policy aspect categories. And now I'm going to hand you over to Jenni.
So all 25 work health safety manager participants undertook the semi-structured interviews. Each participant was asked a range of questions in relation to their current approaches to risk management of psychosocial and physical hazards. The interview recordings were transcribed and then analysed thematically, and a coding framework was developed following the processes described by Braun and Clark. From the analysis, similar themes were found across the health, retail and transport and logistics sectors. Work health safety managers' knowledge of psychosocial hazards was varied, and psychosocial risk management systems ranged from not having anything in place to having comprehensive systems. However, even when systems were in place, they were often new or not yet fully established. Some work health safety managers expressed reluctance to include psychosocial risk management in their organisation's overall risk management system, thinking that it was a bit of a sleeping giant, that it would be too hard, or that talking about psychosocial hazards may open a can of worms. Others expressed reluctance from senior management with the concern that talking about psychosocial hazards would create a flood of injury reports. Work health safety managers reported a lack of resources to support practice in relation to psychosocial hazards, and a lack of confidence in managing psychosocial hazards was also identified. This was reported as being quite different to managing physical hazards, where there are established systems and frameworks for management in place. Awareness of psychosocial hazards and the need to address them was identified for some work health safety managers, and some participants' organisations were planning new management initiatives for managing their psychosocial hazards. A key issue identified was that interventions commonly focused on addressing individual behaviours of workers, which is of course a less effective type of control compared with interventions targeting organisation systems or factors. For example, manual tasks training for physical hazard related to MSDs, and resilience training and employee assistance programs for psychosocial hazards related to MHDs were commonly reported. Less frequently, work health safety managers also reported implementing higher level controls, targeting their intervention at job or organisational level. For example, changing of the work rosters or rotating between tasks to increase task variety, and implementing recommended actions following a workplace psychological assessment. There was a tendency found to be reliant on injury and incident reporting in order to identify hazards, with reactive interventions planned after incidents or injuries had already occurred. Having said that, some work health safety managers reported also using worksite inspections and surveys as part of their hazard identification process. Legislation and regulation was identified as a key driver for work health safety risk management. This was reported as driving practice through the need to pass audits and accreditations, but also to educate and gain support from senior management to implement their work health safety intervention strategies. Senior management was also identified as a separate key driver or barrier on the ability of work health safety managers to implement their risk management strategies. Particularly for bullying and harassment, there were instances where psychosocial hazards could either be managed by work health safety or human resources, making it more difficult for the organisation to manage psychosocial hazards as a whole if the departments weren't working collaboratively. In conclusion, psychosocial hazards need to be effectively addressed to effectively manage MSDs and MHDs. In particular, for policy coverage for psychosocial hazards was of lower quality overall compared with physical hazards. While having good policies doesn't guarantee good practice in the workplace, it can assist with guiding intervention to improve practice. There was evidence that work health safety managers and organisations would benefit from increased resources and support to develop quality policy in relation to psychosocial hazards. For work practices, work health safety managers' knowledge of psychosocial hazards and their risk management varied. However, most interventions were identified as targeting the individual and not organisation-wide strategies. For organisations to manage psychosocial hazards, it requires current research-based policies and a clear framework for appropriate risk management. Education of managers and supervisors in how to implement these strategies is also required to ensure risk management of all workplace hazards. Given the size of the musculoskeletal disorder issue, strategies that assist aligning organisations' policy and practice with the research evidence are needed to start addressing psychosocial hazards' contribution to MSDs as well as MHDs. Thank you.
Time for a question for Jenni and Chris. Over here. I'm going to say, get the microphone.
How did you find it? How did you find the company's understanding of the psychosocial risk management process? Were they using self-assessment or psychosocial risk assessment tools, staff surveys? How did you find their knowledge of the quality of the risk assessment?
Again, that was hugely variable. Some areas said we don't have a tool for that. We don't do that. We don't have psychosocial hazards in our workplace.
Yes, some of them said that.
So it was really quite fundamental.
And others said we have a risk assessment tool for that.
Yep.
But even when they had a risk assessment tool, sometimes they said, but we don't usually need it.
But
That's
some
really interesting.
some places were really good too.
Hi, I've got a question about behaviour contact officers' role, peer support and peer guidance about where to take, say, an interpersonal matter that was causing strain. Did you meet any people who were using those officers or had any feedback about how effective they are?
Yes, an organisation did report using a peer support model, and their initial thought was that it was quite effective and they were quite positive.
Thank you for a very well thought through presentation. My question is just about you mentioned in the last slide about more emphasis needed in translating the research findings to practice. What do you think that might look like? Is it something that you would assume to be at a government policy level and some incentivization to incorporate better risk management processes?
Certainly we found legislation and regulation to be one of the key drivers, and so to come at that level would certainly help guide and encourage organisations to implement. There are voluntary guidelines out there already, but we currently are seeing varied implementation.
Thank you.